Hello, and welcome to Turnbuckle Bros.
Well, hello, and welcome to a very special father and son edition of Turnbuckle Bros. I'm your host, as always, Matt Huett, and with me today is my son, Halen. Halen, welcome to your first appearance on Turnbuckle Bros.
But certainly not the last.
I would have to agree, because if you keep coming up with good ideas like you did today for this podcast, I could see you making several appearances on the show. So what we're going to do today, we're going to call this episode Top 5 with Halen. And of course, everybody that knows us, the Huetts, knows that we are crazy, hardcore, maniacal wrestling fans. We watch it constantly. It's big in our lives, big in our houses, and me and Halen share a big passion for the world of professional wrestling, sports entertainment, whatever you want to call it. And today, Halen's idea is we will discuss our top 5 biggest moments in wrestling. And so basically, Halen came up with a list of 5. I came up with a list of 5. And we're going to list them all off and tell you guys why those are the top 5 biggest moments in wrestling. So we're going to kick it off with Halen's number 5 biggest moment of wrestling. Halen, hit us with it.
My number 5 in top 5 most famous wrestling moments is Shawn Michaels retiring at WrestleMania 26.
Interesting one. Obviously, Shawn Michaels is wildly regarded as possibly the greatest wrestler of all time. A lot of people share that opinion. The wrestlers themselves, usually if you ask a professional wrestler who the greatest in the business is, a lot of them say HBK. And people from my era would tend to say somebody like Ric Flair. However, Ric Flair himself even says that Shawn Michaels is the greatest wrestler ever in the business. So, Halen, let me ask you why. Why did you pick Shawn Michaels retiring, obviously losing the streak versus career match to The Undertaker? Great match from WrestleMania 26. Why did you pick that moment?
Well, I mean, HBK is one of the most famous wrestlers in the WWE history, and of course, WWF. I mean, he started out in the 80s, had a long and successful career. I mean, the fans loved him when he was face, hated him when he was heel. His character in both ways were likable and hateable. Obviously, no one thought that HBK would retire anytime soon in 2010. I mean, with him, wrestling The Undertaker and, appearing in the 2010 Royal Rumble. And I mean, he worked super hard to get his rematch with The Undertaker. Didn't quite beat him. One of the best matches, I think, in WrestleMania history. Although, I think we both agreed that the original one was better.
Yeah, I would agree that, well, I was there. I was in attendance at WrestleMania 25 in Houston, Texas. And quite frankly, I was there live to witness the greatest wrestling match in the history of the business, which was Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker, won at WrestleMania 25, bar none. I saw it live, not just because I was there watching it back. That was the single greatest wrestling match, period, in history.
Their chemistry was outstanding. Their ring work was outstanding. Obviously, both Taker and Shawn were big veterans at the time. Countless title victories, long and successful careers for both of them. And that's why that's my number 5.
Well, awesome. That's a pretty interesting and good number 5. So let's go with Dad's number 5 biggest moment in history. And I picked kind of a weird one. Maybe. I picked the day that Vince McMahon purchased WCW. Now, if you're a fan of maybe my age, my era, when you were a little kid, when the NWA/WCW was really big and the WWF was really big, a kid like me always wondered, oh man, what would happen if the WWF guys went up against the WCW guys? Oh, it'd be the greatest thing ever. What if they became one federation? What if all these different scenarios happen? And of course, throughout the Monday Night Wars, I mean, the Attitude Era / Monday Night War era, I mean, quite frankly, probably the greatest era ever in wrestling. It wasn't bigger at any other point. Hulkamania era, it's kind of hard to argue that. There's pluses and negatives to both. I mean, but the Attitude Era, literally everybody I knew was watching wrestling. It was the hottest ticket in town. It was all over the place, everywhere. Ratings were through the roof, and they had the big war against each other, Vince McMahon and Ted Turner. And obviously, for 83 weeks, the Eric Bischoff regime of WCW reigned supreme over WWE. Vince McMahon at times came close to going out of business. But as we all suspected, Vince came out on top in the end, crushed him, and ended up purchasing WCW and essentially putting WCW out of business, purchased their assets, their video library, everything that was worthwhile, a few contracts here and there. And WCW was essentially dead, minus that invasion storyline that wasn't really all that great to us fans. But do you have anything to add about the day that Vince McMahon bought WCW and the business changed forever?
Well, I mean, WCW was a big company, rivaling WWE at the time, and like you said, there are some points, the mid-90s especially, where we all thought WCW has the better ratings. They might make WWE go out of business. But, I mean, WCW, they had Hulk Hogan. They had Bret Hart. They had, personally, one of my favorite wrestlers, The Big Show. He debuted there.
Known as the Giant at the time.
Yep. They had the Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart. They had, the NWO, which is probably their best moments with the NWO.
Of course.
Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Hogan. But to be honest, Dad, I wasn't really a big fan of WCW. I thought that some of their matches were kind of crappy.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that.
Especially the Giants' first match. But unpopular opinion, I like the motor truck match.
The monster truck match. I knew you were going to bring that. Probably, in my opinion, the worst match of all time. But Halen loves it. Hey, to each their own. Not everybody has to like the same things. Speaking of, easy for me to say, not liking the same things. Halen, what is your number 4 biggest moment in wrestling history?
My number 4 is probably one that a lot of you old-timer fans would put on your top 5 list, and that is at the 1990 Survivor Series, The Undertaker's debut.
Oh, man, I will never forget that moment for as long as I live. The story for that for me is that me and my cousins used to go to our grandma and grandpa's house right up the street and on pay-per-view Sundays. And actually, the Survivor Series used to be on Thanksgiving Eve, that Wednesday night before, back in those days. And so whatever day it was, we made sure to visit grandma and grandpa and needle grandpa all day long and tell him, oh, man, there's a big wrestling Survivor Series is on tonight. So many great matches. And we would sell him on it all day. We'd work on him for hours until he would eventually, of course, make that phone call to his local cable operator and purchase the pay-per-view. Of course, we did that. And we sat there, we watched it, and I will never forget Ted DiBiase's team. He had a mystery partner for weeks and months. We didn't know who he was. All we knew that he had a mystery guy coming in. There's a lot of speculation about who it would be. And then finally, Ted DiBiase does the ring announcing himself, introduces his new partner. When he said, and here's my mystery partner weighing 320 pounds from Death Valley, I give you The Undertaker. And out comes the guy who scared me half to death.
And in the words of the legendary Gorilla Monsoon, look at the size of that ham hock.
Well, Gorilla Monsoon was on commentary, but it was actually Roddy Piper who said that. So pretty
minor
close.
mistake.
Sorry, I had to correct you on that one. But I saw The Undertaker walk out and I was wide-eyed, shocked. And the first thing that went through my mind, and I'll never forget it, I turned to my cousin Danny and I said, Danny, Oh my, I hope this guy never wrestles Hulk Hogan.
And
look at this guy.
And a year later, at the next Survivor Series,
What happened?
We all know what happened. Undertaker, kind of controversially, beat Hogan for the WWF title. Everybody only had it for 6 days as Hogan won it back at this Tuesday in Texas.
That is correct. And I looked at my cousin because we were at Grandma and Grandpa's again and watched that match, Survivor Series 91. And I looked at him and I said, I told you last year. Look what happened. And we were devastated, obviously, that Hogan lost that match. But interesting pick, the Undertaker debut. The Undertaker, obviously, I mean, one could argue he's the greatest wrestler of all time in the business. Definitely maybe one of the most respected and revered by the other wrestlers, maybe the most. How do you not love the Undertaker?
I mean, nobody really hates the Undertaker. He's been in the business for 30 years. Basically, everyone loves him. He was a fan favorite.
Undertaker, one of the most iconic characters and workers in the business of all time. So let's move on to my number 4 moment, my number 4 biggest moment in wrestling. I picked an interesting one, and here it is. Mick Foley getting thrown off of the top of the Hell in a Cell at King of the Ring 1998 by The Undertaker. Tell me what you think about that, Halen.
That was crazy. I mean, nobody's seen anything like that before. That was definitely probably the craziest Hell in a Cell dive, although Shane McMahon's was also pretty crazy as well.
It was. But at that point in the business, the match starts, Mankind comes to the ring, and immediately climbs to the top of the cage. And, of course, Mankind had it in his mind, and he said this, Mick Foley has said this in several interviews, that the match between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels at the first ever Hell in a Cell match at the Bad Blood 1997 pay-per-view that me and Steve of the Turnbuckle Bros went to in St. Louis. We were there to witness this one live as well.
And there was another iconic debut in that match, The Undertaker's half-brother, Kane.
That is true. And so that match was so great that Mick Foley was like, man, what am I going to do to top that match? And ironically enough, he was sitting down with the one and only Terry Funk. And Terry Funk suggested, well, Cactus, why don't you start the match on top of the cage? And Cactus went, well, everybody called him Cactus because he used to be known as Cactus Jack, of course. He said, that's a great idea, Terry. So he started the match on top of the cage, and he came up with the idea that he wanted to do something to steal the show, that's something people would never forget. And he took that huge bump off the cage and through the announce table. As far as big moments in wrestling, I have to put that on there because who in their right mind is crazy enough to do something like that?
Shane McMahon. He did it twice.
Shane McMahon had crash pads and stuff protecting him. Mick Foley didn't. Mick Foley went through that table, landed on the concrete.
But also, that was the Attitude Era.
Also, it was the Attitude Era. And then, later on, he climbs back up to the top of the cage and gets chokeslammed and falls through the cage into the ring. That one, in my opinion, was a much worse bump than the first one he took off the top, because those rings back in those days were notoriously hard, and I believe that was the harder bump. So that is my top 4 moment. Mick Foley going off of the cell, because as far as iconic things that you just see over and over and over again, that's on my list. Halen, I think we're up to number 3 on your list. What's your number 3 biggest moment ever in wrestling?
I don't think Canadians will like this one that much.
Ooh, I know where you're going with this.
Because this is iconic for all the wrong reasons. My number 3 is at the 1997 Survivor Series. You guys all know this. Bret Hart certainly wants to forget this. It is the Montreal Screwjob.
Of course. How could anybody forget that? Maybe the most controversial moment ever in wrestling. Everybody knows the story. We won't beat the dead horse there. But obviously, Bret Hart was on his way out of the WWF. He had signed a 20-year contract with Vince McMahon previous to that and planned on being in the WWF at the time forever. until Vince McMahon came to Bret and said, I just can't honor this contract. I don't have the money. I can't afford it. So I'm going to, if you think you could still get your deal with WCW, I will allow you to negotiate with them. And, you deserve the money. If I can help you get the money, get it. So Bret had to make a tough decision. He was loyal to Vince. He was loyal to the WWF. And he decided $3 million a year is an awful lot of money to turn down. So he decided to jump to WCW. But this was all going on, Halen, when Bret Hart was the WWF champion. So Vince McMahon, I don't know how he ever allowed that to happen while Bret was still champion. However, that was the situation that they were in. Long story short, Shawn said he would never, ever put Bret over. Bret took offense to that and said, okay, well, why am I going to put this guy over who said he would never do the same for me?
That's true.
All this stuff happens. Vince wants Bret to lose the belt to Shawn at Survivor Series. And then Bret says, well, I don't want to lose it to Shawn, and I don't want to lose it to Canada because I feel like it's going to hurt my character. They agreed backstage. It's documented on film on the documentary Wrestling with Shadows that Vince had agreed that there would be a disqualification. I believe that's, the next night on Raw, Bret would forfeit the title. They would get it off him somehow. However, as we all know, that's not what happened. And Vince McMahon decided that he didn't want to risk Bret Hart showing up on WCW with the WWF Championship. And so they decided that at the point in the match where Shawn would put the sharpshooter on Bret, that they would instruct the referee, Earl Hebner, to ring the bell like Bret submitted. The match would be over. He would lose, unbeknownst to Bret. And that's how they got the belt off of them. And boy, what a whirlwind of craziness that happened after that. And a lot of people say that's the day that actually the Mr. McMahon heel character was born. So, Halen, I would say that's a great top 3 moment there. Anything you want to add to the Montreal Screwjob?
I mean, obviously, as you said, Bret Hart was going to leave WWE for WCW. And they both agreed, hey, you'll somehow retain the title against Michaels, but then lose it the next night on Raw somehow. And I imagine what that would be like, actually. And as we all know, Shawn Michaels was kind of a jerk back then. And he was especially a jerk to Bret. And then Bret said one day to Michaels, hey, if I ever have to lose the title, I'd fall on the floor for you or something like that.
Yeah, he wouldn't, he said, if it comes down to it and I got to drop the belt with you, I don't have a problem with that. I'd be happy to do it.
And then Michaels responded by, I would never drop the belt for you. I would never want to lose it to you. And he was just being a big jerk. And then Bret said, well,
Bret was very disrespected by that. And that's why that was the beginning of that, downward spiral that was the Montreal Screwjob. And we all know what happened after that. So good pick, Halen. Great. Let's see. My top 3 biggest moment in wrestling. I am going to go with one that I also watched live on pay-per-view. And this one sort of came out of nowhere. But if you were watching at the time, you knew that this guy was on the rise and something big was brewing. But I'm going with my top 3 moment is when Stone Cold Steve Austin cut the now infamous Austin 316 promo at the King of the Ring 1996. I picked this moment because that is when Austin cemented himself as the next big thing in wrestling, the next top guy. And he cut that promo and said, you got your Psalms, you got your John 3:16. Well, Austin 3:16 says, I just whipped your ass. And it was kind of a shocking thing. And he cut a hell of a promo. And he said, it's Austin's time now. I'm coming after the title. I'm coming after everybody in the WWF. They show up to Raw the next day. And the whole crowd was full of Austin 3:16 signs. It was just something he said. It wasn't a planned out thing. I believe that he defeated Jake the Snake Roberts in the King of the Ring final to win it. And of course, Jake the Snake Roberts kind of had a religious sort of character at the time. He was trying to clean himself up. He was a religious kind of guy, and he was talking about religious stuff in his promos. And Michael Hayes came up to Austin and said, "Hey, Jake just cut a promo before the match, and he was talking about religion and stuff, something you might want to think about for your promo." So Austin said, "Okay." And he just came up with that on the fly. And little did he know, or the rest of us know, that it would be such an iconic phrase and thing synonymous with Austin. The Austin 316, I do believe, might be the most high-selling wrestling T-shirt of all time. I think I've bought it 2 or 3 times. I had one right away, and that was the beginning of the rise of, quite frankly, the biggest star ever in the business, Stone Cold Steve Austin. You got any thoughts on the Austin 316 promo? I'm sure you've seen it a couple of times, Halen.
Mm-hmm. Austin 316, the best selling shirt of all time, like you said. And I mean, Stone Cold's character, when he had his first beer, a legend was born.
Yep, that's true. So now we're up to Halen's number 2 moment in the biggest moment in wrestling history. Halen, what do you have as number 2?
Well, actually, most people would probably have this as their number 1 biggest moment in wrestling history.
Okay.
However, I think this is number 2, and that is at WrestleMania 30, Brock Lesnar breaks the Undertaker's streak.
My heart sank when he said that. And every time I hear it and see that. Halen, why was that such a big moment in wrestling?
Because the Undertaker's WrestleMania streak was the most famous streak probably in all of sports entertainment. I mean, 21-0 going into WrestleMania 30, everyone thought he would beat Brock and continue on being undefeated at WrestleMania. And you know what? My personal opinion is that Brock should not have broken the streak.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much everyone's opinion. Being a student of the business and just loving wrestling and knowing everything about it, I have learned to I've thought about this a lot over the years. Of course, when it happened, I was just shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But the more I've thought about it, I've been able to kind of justify it a little bit. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But one thing I will say is that I feel like that is something that will never, ever become, that will never come close to being matched or broken. There's no one that will ever even get to 21-0. And I kind of feel like the Undertaker probably should have been able to take that with him when his career ended. I mean, just the one thing that no one else ever had a chance of doing. The Undertaker is just synonymous with WrestleMania. I mean, never losing a match at WrestleMania. I mean, winning 21 in a row is something in itself, and even guys in the business, even guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin, and that they were just shocked when it happened and they couldn't believe it. So here I'm going to go back into how I can understand why Vince McMahon made that decision. You want to hear about it?
Sure.
Okay. So a lot of people say, well, Brock Lesnar didn't need that moment. Maybe it should have been somebody else. Maybe they should have used it to propel an up-and-coming star, which I can see and maybe could have been the better call. However, let's look at what happened after that. Brock Lesnar breaks the streak of The Undertaker. Just shock. I mean, even to this day, it's still just a shocking moment. What happened with Brock Lesnar after that? There was not a hotter wrestler in the business probably for at least a couple of years after that. And let's just face it, you can say whatever you want about Brock Lesnar, but he's one of the greatest wrestlers, greatest workers of all time. I don't care what you say. If he wrestles 2 matches a year or 200, he's Brock Lesnar. He's amazing. He's awesome in the ring. And I mean, he's probably my favorite guy.
And now,
right now.
And now he's back.
He's back again now. He just came back recently at SummerSlam. And so it really elevated him, Brock, at the time. He became the hottest star heel in the company. And that's something he can say forever. He was the guy who defeated the streak. Maybe they could have let Roman Reigns do it, and he could have really used that to help propel him at the time, or maybe somebody else, like that. But I'd have to agree, Halen. That was one of the biggest moments ever in wrestling, and that's a pretty good number too.
What is your
You want to hear
number
number
two?
two? My number two is another shocking moment. The night that Hulk Hogan joined the NWO.
Oh boy.
Another shocking moment for me. Of course, I was just a little bit older than you at the time. I was 14 years old at a friend's house watching Bash at the Beach 1996, and the Outsiders had what an angle that was. I was always a WWF loyalist. I always loved WWF more than WCW. Being that I loved wrestling, I always watched both. Right? I liked both, but WWF was far superior to me. But when Scott Hall comes walking through the crowd and makes that appearance on Nitro, just after just seeing him on WWF TV, and then the next week or two later, here comes Kevin Nash, and it looks like that these guys are still into WWF and coming into WCW for a real invasion. I was glued. I couldn't. I had to see what happened. And then they get this big match where it's supposed to be 3-on-3, and they have a mystery partner, Hall, Nash, and a mystery partner versus Sting, Luger, and Macho Man. There wasn't a chance in the world I was going to miss that. Oh my God, that's huge. But nobody knew who the third man would be. And Hogan comes out. And what did he do? What happened when Hogan came to the ring that night?
Everyone thought that, he'd drive the Outsiders out of the ring, beat the crap out of them, save Randy Savage, Lex Luger, and Sting. But when he hit that first leg drop on Savage, the crowd went silent.
Yeah. And that was a shocking moment because the red and yellow had ran supreme for a long time. I mean, Hulkamania was technically born before he was ever in the WWF. His couple of year run there in the AWA, Hulkamania was brewing, and then he was in the movie Rocky III, and then that was huge. And Hogan was starting to become a household name. Then he hit the WWF at late 1983, and then January of 1984, he beats the Sheik for the title, and the red and yellow. You didn't think that was ever going to end. So we're talking what, 12 straight years of red and yellow, Hulk Hogan good guy. A lot of people don't know is that Hulk Hogan was a bad guy before that. Before he was ever a good guy in wrestling, he was a bad guy a lot.
When he debuted, he was a bad guy.
Yeah, he went by different names, and he was a bad guy before, but no one remembers that. You want to remember the heyday of Hulkamania, training, saying your prayers, eating your vitamins, you believe it in yourself, being an all-American kind of person. And when that happened, that was a turning point in the wrestling business. Hogan turns heel, joins the NWO, and I got to admit, WCW had the hot ticket in town for a couple of years after that. I had to watch it every week to see what they were going to do. Hogan was a bad guy. I was shocked. Hogan was my hero my whole life growing up. But he started to get stale. It started to be kind of boring, to Hulk Hogan still being the same guy. But when that happened, I was like, oh, I never thought this would happen. Oh my God. Like, this is crazy. So what do you think about that, Halen?
Well, it is very iconic. Hogan going into the NWO, probably WCW's greatest moment. And for a while, WCW was the better company.
Yeah. Some would say they were the better company. Some would say they wouldn't. But as far as the ratings went, they were kicking WWE's, you know what.
Mm-hmm.
So, big moment. All right, Halen, we're down to your number one biggest moment in wrestling history. Halen, lay it on us. What is it?
Well, before I unveil my number one pick, I'd like to give an honorable mention out.
Oh, okay. Sure, go for it.
It's actually very recent. Not a lot of people would say this is sort of famous since it's very new, but this is actually WWE's new rival company, AEW, who has my favorite wrestler, Pac, who used to be known as Neville, and also has Paul White, aka Big Show. My honorable mention is at AEW Fallout in Chicago, CM Punk coming out and debuting.
Well, I mean, CM Punk technically debuted on the episode of Rampage before that. So are you talking about CM Punk actually coming back to wrestling and wrestling his first match in so long?
Oh no, I'm actually meaning like coming out to the stage, like and making like a promo.
So basically, CM Punk coming back to wrestling on
Yes,
AEW.
on
Okay.
AEW.
You know what? Hey, that is a huge moment, especially now. That's a good pick. And it is kind of helping, in my opinion, as much as I hate to admit it, AEW with massive momentum right now. They are doing a lot of right things. All this talent is going there. They want to work there. Honestly, AEW, there's a good chance that they might just kick WWE's ass.
Yeah, and I mean also Daniel Bryan coming to AEW.
Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, all these guys that are there now. I mean, it's unbelievable. That's a good one, Halen. So that's your honorable mention. What is your number one moment in wrestling history?
Well, I'm sure not a lot of people will be surprised by this one. I'm actually wearing the shirt for this
Show it up.
right now. It is at WrestleMania 3 in 1987 at the Pontiac Silverdome with the highest attendance for a long time until WrestleMania 32. Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant.
How do you argue that one, folks? I mean, I can remember seeing that one as a kid too, and it just that match alone. Was it the greatest wrestling match in history?
No, far
No.
from it.
But you could argue and say that it was, and here's why. Is there a bigger one that you can think of?
No, I mean the match, like the ring work, it was not great.
Is there another match that drew one match? I mean, of course, we talk about WrestleMania 3. A lot of people say one of the greatest matches of all time, or the greatest match in WrestleMania history, was Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage. Yeah, that match was on the card, and it's one of the greatest matches ever. Of course, we could beat that to death.
But
did that match draw? Hogan versus Andre put 93,000 people in that arena. Let's just face it. Has another match ever done that before?
No,
not
really.
It hasn't. And I could these words ring through my head often from thinking about that. At the beginning of the match where Hogan and Andre are standing in the ring and they're facing off against each other, and Gorilla Monsoon saying the famous phrase, "The irresistible force meets the immovable object." For some reason, that just sticks with me. I love that to this day.
Very famous.
And that camera shot, that angle, I can picture it in my mind right now, where Hogan picks up Andre the Giant and body slams him. The flash bulbs are flashing all over the arena. And he runs to the ropes. He comes back and drops the leg on Andre and pins him. That's just unbelievable. Being a wrestling fan, Halen, obviously that's way before your time.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me how that makes you feel. Why is that moment the biggest moment in wrestling history?
I mean, I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't live back in those good old times, because now WWE is kind of, to be honest, I'll always be a WWE fan, but it's kind of stale right now,
I agree.
But back in those days, WWE was hot, and every kid under the age of probably my age was a Hulk Hogan fanatic.
Oh, there's no question about that.
Wrestling was the talk on the streets back in the day.
And as far as Hulkamaniacs go, I'm probably was the biggest one, but definitely the biggest one that I knew. I mean, I can remember a little off the topic of Hogan and Andre here, but have you ever seen any of the stuff where Hogan had a feud with a wrestler called Earthquake?
Yes, I mean, I watched the 1991 Royal Rumble a couple weeks ago. Not a great Royal Rumble, but the final team came down to Hulk Hogan and Earthquake.
Okay. And Hogan and Earthquake were actually feuding for about 6 months before that. They wrestled at SummerSlam 1990. Hogan's team versus Earthquake's team at the Survivor Series 1990. So they were in a feud for a little while before that. And so they had to figure out a way to get Hogan off TV for a while because he was doing a movie called Suburban Commando. And of course, we all know what happened at WrestleMania 6, 1990, which I'll just go ahead and say this is my honorable mention, Hulk Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 6, because it had a huge impact on me as a kid. And of course, we all know what happened, babyface versus babyface match, title for title, and the Warrior defeated Hogan. It's the first time Hogan had ever truly been pinned clean in the ring, especially since his WWF reign started. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that Hogan lost. Hogan never lost. It was just impossible to think that Hogan could ever lose a match to anyone. And the Warrior beat him for the title. And it was back then in 1990, they were kind of thinking, okay, it's time to wind down Hulkamania a little bit. And now they were going to go with the Warrior. Well, we all saw what happened there. But it was a way for Hogan to kind of, they thought 1990 was the twilight of his career. Obviously, he wrestled, damn near another 20 years after that. But in order for them to get him off of TV, so he loses the belt. The Warrior's now the big guy. And then shortly thereafter, Earthquake attacked Hulk Hogan on the Brother Love show. And of course, he jumps him from behind, and Earthquake, his move, I don't know why I said Undertaker. Heck with that. Earthquake's finishing move. Earthquake was a giant guy, a big guy, probably 6'4", 6'5", 400 pounds. And his move was the Earthquake, where he would lay a guy out, he would bounce off the ropes, and he would run and just jump as high as he could and sit on the guy's chest to squash him. I mean, devastating maneuver. He jumps Hogan on the Brother Love show, and he does the Earthquake squash on him just over and over again, like 5 times. No man, even Hulk Hogan, could withstand that. And so Hogan was injured. And that was an excuse for them to kind of get him out of wrestling with an injury. And they put this thing up on the screen to where Hogan needs the Hulkamaniac's thoughts and prayers now more than ever. And they put an address on the screen to where you could write a letter to Hulk Hogan and wish him well and encourage him to make a comeback and stuff. So, of course, I did it. I wrote Hulk Hogan a letter, and I'll never forget it. I don't remember what it said, but I remember that I drew a picture on the bottom of it. And I don't know why I remember this, but I drew a picture of Hulk Hogan way over here. And then I started to draw a picture of Earthquake way over here. And I was like, whoa, I made him too far apart. So I made Hulk Hogan's arm like 20 feet long, and he was punching Earthquake in the face way over here. So Hogan had a 20-foot long arm punching Earthquake in the face on the other side. And I wrote a letter, and I sent it in to the address. A few weeks later, I get a postcard back from Hulk Hogan saying, thank you, Hulkamaniacs, blah, 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 blah. Of course, when they got your letter in, I found this out later, and this might not interest you, Halen, but this is why they did that. They got everybody's addresses off the letters so they could send you WWF catalogs in the mail so that you would order merchandise and buy stuff.
Wow. Also, Hogan, that movie, whatever you're talking about, not the best Hulk Hogan movie.
Suburban
Obviously,
Commando?
the best Hulk Hogan movie is Mr. Nanny.
I don't know. I like them both. Hulk Hogan's horrible movies are great in my book. All right. And so, yeah, that happened, and huge Hulkamaniac, and Hogan. I mean, we can just talk on and on all day long about that, but him slamming Andre, I would agree. It's hard to argue that one, Halen. So good pick for number 1.
What's your number 1?
Do you want to hear my number 1? And this is kind of a weird one, and might be something you could learn a little something about wrestling about. Here's what I chose for number 1. I chose the day that Vince McMahon bought the WWF from his father, Vince Sr. And here's why I picked that. Because Vince McMahon Sr., obviously, I mean, they call him Senior and Junior, but they don't have the same name. But Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. Vince McMahon's father was a big wrestling promoter, obviously, for many, many years before Vince Jr. came along. And he was one of the more well-respected men in wrestling. And so, and what a lot of people may not realize is that he promoted basically the biggest territory in wrestling, the Northeast. That's where guys made the most money. That was like the biggest place to wrestle in a lot of people's eyes at the time. And he ran business very straight and narrow, very respectful guy, this and that and the other. He decides to retire and get out of the business. And his son, Vince McMahon, who we know, Vince McMahon Jr., bought the company from his dad and completely changed everything and did everything the way that Vince Sr. probably wouldn't have done it.
And he changed wrestling forever and for the good ways, even though now it's kind of...
And that changed the landscape of wrestling forever. And basically, Vince McMahon then one by one started purchasing and taking over all of the individual wrestling territories throughout the country. He had amassed all the best talent from all over the world, from all other wrestling companies, and made them into one. He made wrestling a global phenomenon. He put wrestling on pay-per-view. He just completely smashed on cable TV. Vince McMahon buying the company from his father and changing, I think that was the turning point in wrestling and changed wrestling forever. To me, that's the biggest moment in wrestling history. Because what if he didn't do that?
Well, would WWE have had all of those great moments? Probably not.
Probably not.
Would Hulk Hogan have been the superstar he is today?
No.
No. Would Stone Cold Steve Austin have cut the 316 promo?
No.
No. Would Undertaker have his legendary streak?
Nope.
Nope. So yeah, that's our list. Whose list is better? Be sure to put that in the comment section down below. And please subscribe if you like our content.
Well, I couldn't have said it any better than that. So that is our top 5 biggest moments in wrestling special father and son edition of Turnbuckle Bros. So for my awesome son, Halen, and for me, Daddy Huett, we will say adios, everybody.
And be sure to put them in the comments below. Whose list is better? Obviously mine. Now bye.